We're honored this evening to be joined by Ambassador Guy de Muyser, a permanent representative of Luxembourg to the North Atlantic Council. Among his past responsibilities has been to serve as his country's ambassador to the Soviet Union, combining his present position with the North Atlantic Council and his past responsibilities to the Soviet Union. The theme which he is addressing this evening is most appropriate, that is, the European role in East-West security questions. The ambassador holds a Doctor of Laws degree, a diploma in commercial relations from Grenoble University in France, a Master of Arts degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's also studied at the London School of Economics. He served as a counselor in his foreign ministry from 1951 to 1956. He was secretary to the Grand Duke 1956 to 1969. And he was Marshal of the Court of the Grand Duke from 1969 to 1981. He concurrently with his position in the representing Luxembourg in the Soviet Union, he held the ambassadorships in Finland, the Polish People's Republic, and the Mongolian People's Republic. We look forward to benefiting this evening from his wisdom and experience. He's equipped to talk about a wide range of European questions and relations with the Soviet Union. I'm eager to hear what he has to say and how he responds to the questions. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Guy de Muyser.
Thank you very much for your kind words and introduction. I come from a very small country, but you see we grow them tall. This is to make up for the smallness of the country. It's a great honor for me and a great pleasure to speak here today. And in a way, I always, when I speak in the United States, which hasn't been for some time, recall my first speaking experience, which was a very teaching experience. It was when I started at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I was asked to address a high school at a place called Harvard, Massachusetts. And it was not Harvard University, of course, it was not the college, it was a school. And I was asked to present my country, Luxembourg, which I did, not speaking, of course, of such uninteresting things for high school kids as our important steel industry, our role in banking, our role as an international center in the European communities and so on, but stressing the charm of a lovely country, its green valleys and its fortresses and castles and its folklore, its good wine, and its fairy queen head of state. We then had a lady head of state who was Grand Duchess of Luxembourg. And I thought I had done a relatively good job until question period came. A little girl, she was sitting there, stood up, looked me straight in my face and said, "Sir, what kind of a government do you have?" And I was totally taken aback because my English wasn't very good and I hadn't learned the terms with which to describe government. But it taught me that to have a relationship with people, you should not only know the external, the description, the scenery, you should know what lies behind. And I think this is the basis of the trust that we must have for one another, especially if we are obliged for our own security interests, in the interests of our countries, of our nations, of our people, to work together, to have an understanding. And if I speak of Europe's role in the security questions of the world, I refer especially to the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO, because one of the striking features of this treaty is, of course, its military aspect. It's a military organization, but much more, it is a political organization, meaning that there you have a forum, a meeting place for 16 nations' representatives. They come together and they have a unique opportunity, and they have had this now for 38 years, to meet, to confront their views, and to build up a personal relationship, a relationship of knowledge on one side and then of trust. And this is really what NATO is fundamentally about. First of all, to have a knowledge of one another, a knowledge of the problems, of course, but especially a knowledge of how each one of the 16 sees these problems. And when I say each one of the 16, you may be astonished a little bit and ask, there are big ones, the United States foremost, and then there are very small ones, Luxembourg. The impressive feature of our time is that the second half of the 20th century is the period in history where small nations exercise more rights, have more international autonomy and sovereignty than ever before in the modern times. This is, I'm a spokesman for this small country, and I find this is a wonderful example of international democracy. Democracy exists in countries on different levels. It should also exist in the international field. And for my country, we find this extremely gratifying. And we try not to make a bad use of it. But even a small country can be a bridge because of its history, because of its connections, and because of its past experiences. Luxembourg being, in a way, an example of what Europe has been. We've always been located between important neighbors. I'll take the last, Germany and France. And we have been usually crushed by these neighbors until they came to an understanding, which they have now. It's recent, as you know, an understanding that allows us to thrive, to continue to be prosperous, and to play our role as a bridge between two different conceptions of society, different conceptions of life. Of course, the difference in conception between France and Germany are nothing compared to the difference in attitudes towards everything, life, society, structure, that we have when we compare the Western world with the Soviet Union. Again, the Soviet Union is our main challenge, and if you allow me, I'll speak, which is normal, about the Soviet Union in relationship, of course, with the Atlantic Alliance. When you look back on the creation of NATO, NATO was created just to meet one single threat, the threat from the East. It was not created for anything else. So that whatever would happen outside of NATO area would be left out of this treaty of mutual assistance and of mutual help, of mutual cooperation. There was one very distinctive and important feature in NATO. This was NATO had one totally dominating partner, the United States, with a wonderful, horrifying, overwhelming weapon, the nuclear weapon, the nuclear power. But NATO also had then very strong common objectives, a common purpose, common motivations, because of the Soviet threat. When you look at this organization 40 years later, you find that the threat of the Soviet Union, that was twofold. One was military, it still exists, as we know. One was ideological, and this one exists much less. We will return to this. I think it exists much less, at least it is less perceived. It's not perceived anymore as a threat to our democratic survival. Probably in part because we've had this peace for 40 years that we got through NATO. And I may add and underline, we had this peace for nothing else because of NATO. NATO is determinating. Speaking to an American audience, I realize, see, that I have to give you a little bit the feeling of what it means to be in Europe, living 250 miles away from Soviet troops in Eastern Germany. 250 miles. It's no distance. This is where Luxembourg lives. And this is how we perceive a threat, a dangerous situation, a risk, much more immediately than, of course, you can do. What is the Soviet Union for you? It's an enormous power. It's an ideology. It's a dangerous adversary. But it's far away. And you're enormous. You're much stronger. You're much more prosperous. You're much more scientifically developed. So your outlook is basically more, could I say, more relaxed than the fear that we had in Europe and still have to a large extent because of the proximity of this neighbor. Ideologically, I said the neighbor has become, the adversary on the other side has become a little bit less frightening. Of course, this is the Gorbachev phenomenon. It's also the fact that we had 40 years of peace, and peace peace is a kind of a lullaby. You are lulled into the feeling that nothing is going to happen, that you're quiet, that you're safe. The Gorbachev has also changed some of our perceptions, and I will return to this if there's time, because, and if I find my watch somewhere, because I have this personal experience of Moscow, having lived there for 4 years, just until a year and a half ago. Now, 40 years later, NATO's basic assumption has also changed. The basic assumption was there is only one single threat. It comes from the east of Europe to the west of Europe, or to the whole democratic world. It's the Soviet Union. And everything that was outside of this area was called out of area and was left out of NATO, was left out of this cooperation of friendly democratic nations that needed one another. It was left out to a great extent because the United States in 1949, when NATO was created, didn't want to get involved in the European in the problems Europe was bound to have, because Europe then still had colonies, and it was obvious that the United States wasn't there to defend European colonies or problems that arose out of those. But now there are threats in different parts of the world. I only have to speak of the Gulf, Latin America, other parts. Now, if we are a community of nations, if we have the same basic aims and objectives, and if our destinies and our objectives, our motivations are very strongly linked together, we must ask ourselves, can we maintain a partnership of cooperation in security only based on one area, the East-West area, the Soviet Union against, or the Warsaw Pact against all the others? Or should we not widen our cooperation? That's a basic question. It's not as yet addressed to formally, and by formulating it, I take a certain risk. But it's an underlying question. If you have a community, you must decide whether you want this community to play its role erga omnes, against all or many, or if you don't. This is a problem we have to solve over the years to come. The other problem is, how do we react to a change in threat? The United States has decided, with the formal approval of all its NATO partners, that we can dispose of medium-range nuclear weapons that defended Europe. Now, that's a very typical, an example, the negotiations that started in Reykjavik, or in Geneva earlier if you wish. It's a very typical example of the reactions of public and political opinion, because we, the West, had proposed the scrapping of intermediary nuclear forces, INF, already long ago, 79, 81, 82. The Soviets had never accepted it. Now, when at the latest, and we had said we want Europe to be free of this type of nuclear weapons, not of all, but of this type, for a number of reasons that you probably know because so much has been said about it. When the Soviets rejected it, we said, ah, the ugly Soviets. Now in Reykjavik, there was suddenly a possibility that they would accept. And the European public opinion said, this is horrible, this is terrible, Europe will be nude. We won't have any umbrella. The American umbrella will have gone. What are we going to do? And this strange and contradictory reaction, that I'm not sarcastic, I'm just describing, and I hope I have the right as an independent, as a dependent official of an independent country to do so. It is striking, is in a way funny, but it also entailed a greater sense of the real balance of power and the real situation in this field. If the United States, we noticed after Reykjavik, if the United States would reduce its presence, military presence in Europe, Western Europe would have either to make up for this or to abandon part of its security with everything that such an abandonment would entail. And if we would have to make up for it, how would we make up for this? And we noticed that although we are prosperous nations, although we are 14 European nations, or 13 if you leave Iceland out, these nations would not be, in real terms, able to match what America brings to Europe in terms of security assurances. So if, beyond the phase of the INF scrapping, the United States would withdraw, as one sometimes hears, part or all of their troops in Europe. I'll come to the reason of this in a moment. If the US would go back to the states in a way and apply, in a modern term, in the 20th century, the Monroe Doctrine, there would be for Europe a great danger. And Reykjavik made the Europeans aware of this, thereby also, this is at least my interpretation, also making us aware that if you are under the umbrella of the expression is so often used, so I will repeat it, the umbrella of a strong partner in a coalition, you have to accept a certain feeling and certain consequences of a dependence, which Europe as independent democratic nations sometimes had difficulties to accept. It was so nice to live quietly in a system of security that was 30, almost 40 years old, and not to put any questions. Now the questions are on the table, and what we realize is that the future of Europe is being carved out this year, next year, over the next time, for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So it's really an important moment in European history, and it is this important since that is a little bit frightening. And when I say a little bit, it is a little bit too little. It is frightening. We don't know what it will be. But what I would like to tell an American audience is that what happens to Europe still is, I think, much more important to the United States than what you would believe looking from here across the ocean. For you also, the Soviet Union has become less aggressive. For you also, the Soviet Union contains an element of hope because of the new Gorbachev course. For you, of course, the Soviet Union remains a very dangerous and partly non-predictable partner. Yet, what does Europe mean for you? Europe means, very often we hear that, Europe means a group of nations who take an advantage of your power, your nuclear weapons, and doesn't give enough back to you, doesn't pay enough of its own share. This is, I should say in real terms, not true. And to say this, I looked into the matter. Of course, it's not just an assertion. It is, Europe makes an effort in men conscripted. Most of the European nations still have conscription, which costs much less than the American system of having voluntary armies, but produces just as many or more soldiers. But in budgetary terms, it's less spectacular. I said it costs less. The only nations in Europe who have that have no military draft conscription is Britain, Iceland, I should remember them all by heart, Iceland and Luxembourg. But but Luxembourg is so small. Sometimes we take advantage of our smallness. In budgetary terms, overall, Europe produces an effort that would, in time of war, represent 10 million out of 14 million soldiers under arms. In terms of material, it would represent 60% of what Europe would have to mobilize to counter a Soviet threat or a Soviet attack. But I think there are other aspects of the European importance for the United States that are more vague and yet just as important. Just imagine the United States in a world where Europe would be, as they say, Finlandized, would not be there as a group member of the club of democratic nations. There would be an enormous market of 260 million people, the access to which would be much, much more difficult, and there would be no relationship with the problems that now arise sometimes between the United States and the European communities. You know that there are some problems, and I personally regret. I think that Europe should be much more understanding, much more liberal, because we should balance the advantage in security by other concessions, but this is not always done. If Europe were, I don't even speak of the possibility that I wouldn't dream and think of, that Europe ever would become a satellite of the USSR. But just imagine if the exchange in trade, in economy, in science, technology, would be stopped at the European borders. It would be a major disaster for world economy, and thereby also, I believe honestly, a major problem for the American economy, because we are much more linked together than we usually think. If we live in our surroundings, in our cities, we have the feeling that we are self-sufficient. In fact, the interwovenness, if you allow me that word, of our economy, of our daily life, of our scientific life, so important, is much bigger and much larger than we often realize. There is another field in which Europe plays a part that one doesn't always take into account when one says Europeans should not help, but should be at the side of the United States in problems concerning the third world. Europe does play an important role. There are some interesting figures. I don't like to quote figures, as I told, but there are some. If they suit my purpose, I like to quote them. The US aid, both bilateral and multilateral, to the third world was, my figures date back to 85, 86, was about $9 billion. The European communities had $11 billion, of course, $11 billion to offer to these countries. And multilateral and bilateral aid is, of course, one of the most important and most potent means of not only helping these countries for their needs, but also to develop them. And it's in the development into an industrially more advanced stage that one can stabilize politically these countries and bring them nearer to our democratic system that we think is the best and that we are so glad to have. And that, incidentally, constitutes the great victory of the Western world, the industrial society, with all that goes with it. We very often think that the Soviets have had successes, that in the third world there are Marxist parties, there are countries that look to Moscow for their ideology, for their political system. What we very often forget is that these countries, first of all, get almost nothing from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gives them words, gives them ideology, and this is nice for a while. You can speak to your girlfriend and tell her nice things. This is all right for an evening or two, but afterwards you have to really show who you are. And even underdeveloped countries don't need so much time to realize that the Soviet Union hasn't much to offer. They don't have much to offer. Why, basically? And maybe during the question period I'll come back to this, because the Soviet Union itself is an underdeveloped country. And one underdeveloped country, highly underdeveloped country, I should rather say lowly underdeveloped country, having not much to offer. This is an economic fact that the West must take into account and should take into account and exploit. We are doing it, we are not doing it maybe enough. There is a possibility for exercising our policies more intensely. But it's certain that in a world where the United States is not faced by the East-West conflict alone anymore, as I already said, but by many other crisis centers, Europe must take over a still larger part of its security. And there is where the problems begin. It's very difficult to get 13 independent democratic nations to organize themselves or their security in a coherent common way. We could do this in NATO because NATO is a fabulous structure, and fabulous really is the word for it. Never in human history have 16 nations for such long a time be working together, and they have achieved such results as you have in NATO. I started saying that this was not only because of the military aspects. NATO would have long been forgotten if only it had been for a military cooperation. NATO is a political institution, and you have this political institution is much more potent than institutions like the United Nations. In the United Nations, everybody who comes does like me. He speaks. He has usually a written out text that I don't have, and the other fellow answers. And there are 140 or 142 speeches, but there is no dialogue. There is not what you have in NATO around the large round table, where Secretary of State Schulz explains to his colleagues his views of the next 30 or 40 years. And I must assure you, you hear him often on television, when you hear him speak to his colleagues, ministers of NATO, he is a very impressive man, and he is a wonderful debater. But he shares, and so do the French, the German, the British, the other foreign ministers or ministers of defense together. So they exercise an influence on one another. And if you would have to reproduce this on a purely European level, it would be extremely difficult, because either you would have to subtract the 13 European nations from the 16 NATO and create a parallel organization. And what would be its relationship with NATO? It's a very complex and difficult point. Secondly, if you would organize Europe independently and have a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with the United States, it would be difficult for the Europeans to find amongst them a leader. And such a treaty you need somebody who leads you. You cannot just say, oh, we're 16, in turn there'll be once the British, and then the French, and then the Luxembourg, and then the Belgian, and some other who takes over, because the input is so different. And mainly, the political views of the countries are not the same. In NATO, they're kept together. And I always pretend that the United States has had on European policies a very strong integrating effect. We have our European integration, which is economic, which tends now to be political, but we need more time. We're not ready yet. And we're not ready yet for this type of political integration that NATO provides us. So there are problems ahead, and the problems become more complicated if you then look into the specific problems that face the European area. For instance, the main problem is the relationship between Western Europe, NATO Europe, and Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact, under the dominance of the Soviet Union. What will this relationship be? What will be the relationship between West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, the German so-called Democratic Republic? There is a tendency for the Western Germans to say, we want to restore our national unity. And if you are democratic, you must grant them the right to tend, to try, to tend at least, towards such a unification. But the problems, of course, would be that if you unify, you couldn't unify on our Western democratic terms. You would have to unify somewhere in between if you don't want to give the Federal Republic outright to the Soviet Union. And where is this in-between? This in-between is certainly not for a unified Germany to be a full-fledged member of NATO. The Soviet Union would never accept that. So where is Germany going to be? Those are questions that face the alliance, but they're also questions that face Europe itself. Because what the Germans are doing or what the French will be doing, of course, is of great importance and interest to the smaller ones in Europe, such as Luxembourg, standing before you. Maybe it's our smallness that makes us, at the same time, fear more, because we have no means to defend ourselves. And I finally saw somebody whom I was looking for. Hello. Sorry. For the others, there was just one whom I knew from before, I think. And as I said, the future is going to be carved out now. One must be very careful about the future, because the problem with the future, as we all know, is that we can analyze the past, we can draw lessons from it, we can analyze the present, we can also project the present into the future. But we don't know what will be the elements that will determine the future. And this is why I think the best is to rely on certainties. And one certainty, certainly, is for the Europeans, as well as for the Americans, to keep as much of the coherence, the unity, the cooperation that has made the world so livable and so stable over the last 40 years. If we want to hope that the Soviet Union, the Eastern countries, the popular democracies, as they call themselves, are changing, it's all for the better. I think nobody would object this. But we should not forget what is essential for ourselves and for our societies. And this is the reason why NATO sends people like me around the NATO world to speak to audiences like you, to try to catch your attention. I hope I've done it in a not too scholarly, in a not too severe way. But it's not a matter that is where one should tell too many jokes, because it's much too important and much too serious. Next week, you will hear probably somebody who tells you a different story because he comes from a different country. I would like to be here next week and ask some questions to a man from Nicaragua. He has probably some good arguments, but he certainly will have trouble explaining his objectives or the objectives of his country in such candid terms as a European should be able to do it if he were a better speaker than I. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. We'll repeat the questions in our usual fashion. Yes, ma'am.
Would you comment a little bit on Europe's attitude toward Gorbachev? We hear so much in this country about the concerns about doubting him, and I wondered if Europe had the same feeling since you've been in the Soviet Union. Could you evaluate it a little bit?
Shall I repeat? Would you repeat the question?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The question is, would you present the European view of Mr. Gorbachev?
Great.
That was stretching it rather. You were much more cautious and said my view, and I will stick to my view. Two things. Gorbachev himself is an outstanding man, no doubt. I met him once. I don't want this to be misunderstood. I'll be very positive about him. Don't think I'm a Marxist. I am not. I met him once long before he was elected. Nobody spoke about his election, and came back wrote a report home to Luxembourg saying that I just met a man who is too young, in Soviet terms, to be eligible for one of the very high offices. But the impression he gave me was the following: if you put this man on the board of any Western company, within 5 years he would be the president of this Western company. Okay, now don't shoot. The other thing is, the question that I always hear, and you have hinted at it, is Gorbachev sincere? Now to answer this is relatively easy. Gorbachev is as sincere as was Bismarck, Napoleon, or anybody else who is an important man and who tries to reform or to do something with his country. He is not sincere vis-à-vis NATO, vis-à-vis the United States. Why should he be? He defends the interest of his country, and that's all. And I think that we should understand in judging him, in assessing him. He is a highly intelligent man, and he is not lonely. I think he is the top of an iceberg. There is a whole generation of intelligent people, well-educated, who now come to an age where they can take over and get over part of the Soviet paralyzed society that Mr. Brezhnev represented so well. But when I said earlier that the Soviet Union is an underdeveloped country, this is not only in terms of mechanics, of technology, and of science. This is also in terms of people available for highly developed, highly scientific, I'm searching for a word, for difficult economic jobs. And I give you an example that is very striking. The Soviet Union handles all its external trade through all the financial questions relating to external trade through a bank called the Bank for Foreign Trade. It's now going to be changed a little bit, but this Bank for Foreign Trade that handles billions of rubles or of dollars, if you prefer, has a staff of 1,000 people. Now, I'm sure that most of you are conversant with the numbers of people working in an average bank in Luxembourg. It's really not the biggest country in the world, as you have already noticed, and I don't hide it. We have 3 banks that do our home business. And each one of these 3, we have 140 banks because we're a banking center, but this is international. For the home business, we have 3 banks, and each one of these, for a country like Luxembourg, with a population of less than 500,000, has between 1,200 and 1,300 people working. So you see, there is a handicap, and this handicap you will not overcome. There's a psychological handicap. There's the well-known passivity of the Soviets. There is especially something which I find very striking, and which is maybe too little underlined. Gorbachev has to organize his country from top to bottom. The Soviet Union always, Russia, was always organized from top to bottom, contrarily to our societies. That maybe this was not the case when the founding fathers, set up this republic or this federation. They organized it from top to bottom. But since you have an influence that is very strong from bottom to top, which is the essence of democracy, and this you do not have in the Soviet Union. Everything has to be, as yet, decided from the top to bottom for a number of reasons, but I need 43 minutes and a half to tell you these. But another handicap he has, which is just as important, is that there is no alternative. You have no opposition. And you can't create opposition just like that. Opposition needs to be grown. It takes a long time to have dissenting opinions, to have the courage and the mechanisms of dissenting opinions. They have no mechanisms. So if they really want to get a society where there will be the impact of conflicting views, which is what makes our societies grow, and which is the wonder of the Western white society. I'm very much in favor of our society, and I think we are allowed to say that. If he wants that, he must first create a multiplicity of pluralistic opinions. But this takes a long time. And to give you an example that relates to my own country, mechanisms in political terms. In the 11th century, Luxembourg had a lady, head of state, and she's usually presented as a very kind person dealing out rights to the cities, the famous cities' rights, which allowed a certain amount of self-government to our cities in the 11th century. Now, in fact, this lady didn't give away these rights with a smile. She was probably furious because the city's pressure group, political pressure groups, had deprived her of part of her autocratic rights. This we had in the 11th century. So you see, we have a long, speaking now of my country, other countries have had that also. It takes a very, very long time to grow the kind of checks, balances, but not only checks and balances, influences, impulses, stimulants that we have in Western society and that we should be very grateful for. We should not abuse, as we sometimes do, but we have it and they don't. I attended a few days ago a conference where there was a panel, a Soviet, American panel or American-Soviet panel on numbers of questions, and one was on the freedom of the press. And one of your outstanding journalists who had the mishap of being trapped by the KGB, although he was very, very innocent, Nick Danilov, was on the panel and said something very wise. He said, you cannot have a free press if you don't have an opposition. And on the other hand, you can probably not have an opposition if you don't have communication channels, meaning a press or television. And these do not exist. I'm sorry to have been relatively long, but your question was relatively fundamental. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I was, of course I was aware of this, but most people are, that the ideological threat of the Soviet to Europe, and we're talking strictly vis-a-vis Soviet Europe, has virtually been dissipated. But the military threat, you say, remains. And I'd like to understand this more thoroughly. First of all, we have 13 nations, most highly industrialized, probably the most advanced technological society, social as well, confronted with, as you say, a third world country, Soviet Russia, with perhaps 280 million people and some satellites that are likewise undeveloped. How valid, how realistic is this military threat? Certainly the government, the Soviet government, is not as aggressive a nation as Hitler's Germany was. Could you explain that?
The question is, how can an underdeveloped country, the Soviet Union, constitute as serious a military threat as you suggest it does?
I repeat, indeed, it's an underdeveloped country, but even an underdeveloped country can have sectors of its activity that are highly developed. And this is the case for the military. It is always said that the Russians inherited two things from the Mongols that kept them captive for over 300 years. The Mongols were maybe not highly developed, but they had a highly developed administrative system on two levels. One was their military organization that was one of the best in the world and that allowed them to overrun most of Asia and some of other, well, even beyond. The other one was their fiscal system. They levied contributions and money from everybody and were very clever. And these two administrative organizational systems have been inherited by the Russians and then by the Soviets. So that the threat in military terms is much bigger than the threat would be in economic, in scientific and other terms. The parallel I want to do, people say, but usually, but they go up to the moon, so they are fantastic. and we must fear them. Yes, of course we must fear them, but they go up to the moon, just as the French King Louis XIV built the Chateau de Versailles, which didn't mean that everybody was lodged, was living like the king. Most people were living in huts and were living miserably in the late 17th century. See, that's a parallel. And I think it answers your question. Militarily, the Soviet Union is much stronger, and then the Soviet Union has a unified direction, which doesn't take account of the opinions of people, because there are not many opinions. And anyway, the decision is taken at the top. So that makes them very dangerous, even if they are not, if they have no Hitler, no Mussolini, or no other crazy person or dangerously ambitious person at the top. I hope this is an answer that will make you understand why we're so much afraid, even now, of the Soviet Union. The one thing we're less afraid is that their ideology will use their military power to extend its domination. I think that is the Soviets have probably understood that Marxism is not, should I say prudently, not yet ready to be exported. Maybe they have understood, and we hope, maybe they've understood that it is not exportable at all, because if you would ask me the question, I would tell you there is no real Marxism in the Soviet Union, to start with. It is a class society. It is a society that is not organized according to the basic rules that you can read in books that are published, but not applied. But that's another question. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
According to what you say, I wonder if perhaps the Soviet mindset is rooted actually in paranoia. And if that's so, is Mr. Gorbachev capable of overcoming that? Is he strong enough to overcome that?
The question is based upon the premise that the Soviet mind might be rooted in paranoia or characterized or driven by paranoia, and if so, can Mr. Gorbachev overcome that?
I'll try to answer this question indirectly. Directly, the answer would be yes, probably. Paranoia, yes, probably he could overcome it. This would be the direct answer, and with some explanations. I think nations, people, grow just as individuals do. And there is, in Russian history, there was always a great feeling of insecurity. And as you know, insecurity makes people aggressive. It's a matter of defense. There was not only an insecurity in geographic, military terms, there's also an insecurity in economic terms, of course. This is partly why they spy. They're afraid of us, so they want to imitate us, of course, but they want to learn from us also. And don't excuse spying at all, but I just try to explain it. And then there was mostly the insecurity in terms of philosophy, of organization of society. And that now brings me to the indirect answer, which is how does Soviet society, how do people react? How did they grow? Where is their background? Their background lies in a history of invasions, of centralized government, of non-human rights in terms of community rights, in terms of social rights. And it also lies in something which we tend to forget, which I say with some reservations, because I should immediately say beforehand that I highly respect religions, but Russia is still the dominating factor in the Soviet Union, so I will address myself to the Russians. Russia was directed, inspired, guided by the Orthodox religion. The Orthodox Russian religion, which is different from the Orthodox Greek. Now, there are a number of features to this religion. One was that there was no opposition between God and the state. The Tsar was the son of God, and therefore you don't have what we had in Europe and what was exported into the United States, the very creative tension between state and church, between material and between religious, practical and ideological. You didn't have that. So that whatever the state said came in a way from God. Secondly, what was worse, Orthodox religion has a very beautiful aspect that goes back to the book of Job and says, sufferings are imposed upon you by the will of God. You must support these, accept these sufferings passively. Because if you react against them, you react against God. Now, is there anything more paralyzing? You accept everything that comes from the authority. You accept even everything that comes from any place, from any source, because you think, you're told that this is good for your life, your second life after the life on this earth. Those are very strong features, and you still find them now, even if the Lenin and his followers have tried to erase religion for a number of reasons, the reasons which I explained being probably unconsciously for them one of them. They haven't been so successful because you can't change people very quickly. And if you look into the history of nations, you will find that strangely the French have been French for a long time and will continue to have French reactions for a very long time. Although there's a free flow. They can buy any book, they can go to any place. I'm married to a French wife. And we've been married for 32 years, so there's no tension if you wish. But I know what I'm talking about. And even the Luxembourgers, this small nation in the center of Europe, we have our very specific features. So do the Russians. And it's very difficult to overcome these. There's yet another point that one very often forgets, as we have some more minutes left. I think I mentioned that to you earlier. Russia, or the Soviet Union, is one of the very rare examples in modern history, human history, with Cambodia, maybe, and I don't know what other country, that has, in a revolution, in a moment of great unrest and of great upheaval, has deprived itself of its own intellectual, cultural head. In a way, this is like a self-auto-mutilation. And this, I can give figures for this. Between the revolution 1917 and 1922, 23, before Stalin started to cut heads, Russia lost 10 million people